Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay. The next speaker that you will hear from is Commons Zeldenrust.
All right. Hi, everyone. Oh, okay. This is Stream Left or Stream Right, and I'll be getting into a little bit of the politics of streaming. So first, a little background. So the idea, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to research, what kind of data analysis I wanted to do, but Dr. Warnock gave me the idea that, somewhere she heard or saw that certain streaming apps were labeled either Republican or Democratic, and I thought that was really interesting. And I was curious, I wonder if there was like a subconscious thing when choosing apps, or if it's just purely coincidental if some apps are considered more Democratic or Republican. So the purpose, why does it matter, right? Who cares if a Republican is watching Netflix? Right now, we already get a lot of good demographic data for streaming apps, including gender, generation based on what age you are, and also income, which is really important for setting price points. So offering another topic of data would be really good just for, selecting what shows you want your platform to have and what kind of audience you're trying to reach. And also bringing it to the marketing side for ad agencies when they're deciding where to target certain audiences and put their ads, especially around important events like voting or political events. So a little of the process. My preliminary research, I wanted to see if there's any other studies out there that were already like this, just to see if I could replicate something, but didn't really find anything. I did find a study that the Morning Consult did. And by the graph, it looks like the Republican is kind of leading, but it's actually backwards because they asked survey respondents who don't subscribe to or use someone else's password. So that means Republicans are not subscribing to streaming services and not using passwords. So as a whole, all the streaming services tend to lean a little more left, and the difference in the conservatives and liberals were at least 10 percentage points higher for Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, HBO Max, and Peacock Premium, which are the pretty big main apps. So this allowed me to kind of focus in my research. I wanted to look at the top streaming service someone used and the political party affiliation. I wanted to look at the top streaming service someone used and a political rating, which is where they place themselves on a political number line. I want to look if there's any shared factors at all between survey respondents and also just to get a good demographic look at the data. So I created a Google Forms survey, 15 total questions. I think 13 were required, as well as there being a consent form. I offered them 17 streaming choices and I had them choose which ones they pay for. And I also offered an other option and I do not pay for a subscription option. And then I had them choose which one they used the most, which I labeled as the top streaming variable. And I also had them identify a political party that they were, either Democratic, Independent, or Republican. And then I also had them respond if they were near middle or far right or far left. I also included a cable question. So for people who don't pay for streaming services, I wanted to see if they paid for cable, because it's also another hypothesis out there that cable services are bought more by Republicans or even older generations. So I wanted that data. So on the bottom left, that's my number line that I offered. So I purposely did 1 through 6. I didn't want there to be a complete middle because I feel like people would be too comfortable just choosing the middle. I wanted people to be forced to either say they leaned left or lean right, for conservative or liberal. And yeah, I also got qualitative data. So for the top streaming service that you watch, I had them just give a brief little, why did you choose to pay for this app? I also limited this survey to people who pay for the subscription themselves. I didn't want password sharing. I didn't want people who got it free with a phone bill. I specifically wanted people who were actively making the choice of buying a streaming service. So getting into results. First, so looking at the top streaming service by parties. So we can see that Netflix clearly is the most used, most popular streaming service. And it's pretty dispersed between parties. It's a little leading in Republican and Independent. But then we can see YouTube TV, Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, and Amazon Prime Video were primarily Democratic. And ESPN, DirecTV Stream, and the cable users were Republican. Then next, a lot of numbers here, but just basically wanted to see, this is the number line that I had people place themselves on. We can see mostly, like I thought, it would be near the middle, but we did have some extremes, and as a whole, it did lean pretty to the right, to more conservative. But I will say 45%, which was the majority of my respondents, were identified as Republican. So I guess that would make sense if the number line would be skewed that way. And then I wanted to see if they had any shared factors. So I ran a K-means cluster analysis with 10 different criteria. So I looked at their top streaming variable, their case number, cable, gender, age, party, as well as splitting it up into Democratic, Independent, and Republican, because I wanted to see if one stuck out more than the other. And then their political rating. So first I found the optimal number of clusters. Originally I went with 7, because that's kind of where the elbow graph levels off at. But I found that was too many clusters, because one cluster just had one person, and I didn't think that was very representative. So I went with 3, which was good. And then on the bottom there, that's what it spit out in our studio. So on our rows, we have the 3 clusters, and then all of our 10 criteria and the means that it split into each cluster. And I put those in cross tabs because it's a little bit easier to read than that. So party by cluster, we can see that the first cluster was predominantly independent. The second cluster was predominantly Democratic. And then the third cluster, while it is pretty evenly split, I went ahead and said it was primarily Republican, just to have a label on that. And then comparing that to the top streaming service they used by the clusters they were sorted into, we can see Netflix was sorted mainly into cluster 1 and cluster 3, which makes sense because that's the predominantly independent and the Republican clusters, which tracks. And then we can see YouTube TV and Disney Plus were sorted into 2, which would make sense because that's the predominantly Democratic cluster, as well as ESPN and even Hulu. So yeah. And then demographics, so age, I had a pretty wide age range, from the low 20s to the high 60s. Most of that data being pretty in the middle. And then for gender, I had 64% female responses and 34% male, as well as a 2% non-binary. Netflix, clearly predominantly female. But then ESPN, Hulu with the live subscription, HBO Max, Hulu, and Paramount Plus, all predominantly male. So again, just another way to look at the demographics. So conclusions, just some observations. So all of the non-streaming and the cable users were Republican, as was ESPN and DirecTV Stream. YouTube TV, Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, and Amazon Prime Video all lean to the left, so more liberal. Most respondents lied near the middle of the political spectrum, but with a higher number of responses, I think there would be more extremes to analyze. So kind of next steps for this, I think it's important data. I think it'd be useful to certain companies. So serving across a bigger range of respondents for more accurate analysis. And more accurate political data could allow streaming services to select shows and movies that better target their audiences, get revenue up. And then it could also allow ad agencies to target consumers through streaming services. As a whole, I think data analysis is really important. It offers significant data, and to be available like that, I think the more data you have, the better able you are to make informed decisions, which I think is important for a company. So thank you. That's all.